Sim racing is one of the most immersive and thrilling forms of gaming that you can experience in the comfort of your own home. Even if you have a very basic setup, you can feel what it's like to be a racing driver in hyper-realistic simulations. Buy a half-decent setup and virtual reality and you'll be fully engrossed in a virtual motorsport experience. Additionally, it's one of the only forms of gaming in which skills learned can actually transfer over to real life. In the last few years, sim racing has taken the mainstream by storm, and with the help of COVID, more motorsport fans have taken the plunge into the simulated racing world. It's of no surprise that in recent times, sim racing has become an official esport and has featured on TV stations like ESPN as a replacement for real motorsport. With both real life drivers and professional sim racers taking part, it bridges the gap between gaming and motorsport. If you're a fan of sim racing and love the esport, you may be interested in the origins of this great genre. In this video, we'll be taking an in-depth look at the history of sim racing, from start to finish. So, keep watching if you want to find out more about this awesome pastime. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to hit those like and subscribe buttons. Only a very small percentage of my viewers are actually subscribed, so it'd mean a lot if you did. Thank you. To get to the very birth of simulated racing, we need to go all the way back to the 80s. Where else? According to my statistics, roughly 51% of you hadn't even been conceived back then, including me. Anyway, back to the point. Many gaming genres were birthed in the arcades of the 80s, and well, sim racing is no exception. I'm sure many of you can remember your first driving game experience in an arcade. One was a truck driving game in which you had to reverse your trailer into a parking space using a wheel, pedals and shifter. This was in the early 2000s and I was way too young to comprehend the inverted steering of reversing a trailer, and I mostly watched my dad play it, but I still thought it was one of the coolest things ever. Let me know your experiences down in the comments, I'd love to hear them. Prior to the division between arcade-style racing games and sim racing, the earliest attempts at providing simulation experiences were racing video games in arcades. One of the earliest was a game called Pole Position. It was an arcade game released in 1982. It was developed by Namco and published by Atari. It was heavily publicised for its, and I quote, unbelievable driving realism. It provided a Formula 1 experience behind the racing wheel. It featured AR drivers to race against, and they even caused collisions with other vehicles. Honestly, this was state of the art for the time, or so I hear. It also included the first ever qualifying lap concept into a video game, where the players needed to complete a time trial before they could compete, and it pioneered the third person perspective, which is used in almost every racing game today. Pole Position 2 was released just a year later. It had several improvements made over its predecessor, including a selection of tracks, a greater sense of realism forcing players to actually brake or downshift, force feedback and a unique 3-screen display that offered a more 3D look to the game. Although this was a second instalment, most would consider this the first ever sim racing title, and not just an arcade game with a wheel instead of a joystick. In 1986, Konami released WEC Le Mans, a racing simulator based on the 24 Hours of Le Mans race. It attempted to realistically simulate car driving like never before, with suspension physics that reacted to the track and simulated spins based on driver input, to rumbling and force feedback depending on what surface the driver was driving on. WEC Le Mans also featured a day-night cycle and even accurately simulated the track, with full approval from Automobile Club de la Quest. With an emphasis on acceleration, braking, gear shifting along with the need to counter steer to avoid spinouts, this sim made huge leaps since the first ever racing simulator just 4 years prior. The 1990s were considered an incredible decade for technology as a whole, and sim racing wasn't left out. With the exponentially increasing technological power and overall computer power the average person could buy, developers were starting to push the boundaries. The first game I'm going to mention was released in 1989, however, I put it in this category because to my understanding it released near the end of '89 and became popular in the 90s, with the publicity and ports to personal computers. This game was Papyrus's Indy 500 The Simulation. The game is often generally regarded as the personal computer's first true auto racing simulation. Unlike most other racing games at the time, Indy 500 attempted to simulate realistic physics and telemetry, such as this portrayal of the relationship between the 4 contact patches and the pavement, as well as the loss of grip when making high-speed turns, forcing the player to adopt a proper racing line and believable throttle-to-brake interaction. It also featured a garage facility that allowed users to make modifications to their vehicle, including adjustments to the tyres, shocks and wings. With Indy 500, players could race the full 500 miles, where even a blowout after the 450th would take the player out of the competition. The simulation sold over 200,000 copies. It was around this time that sim racing began distinguishing itself from arcade-style racing. The next major milestone was the 1992 release of Formula 1 Grand Prix by Microprose. This moved the genre along significantly. Multiplayer was made possible by allowing drivers to take turns, and racers could also hook up their machines via a modem cable. However, this only allowed 2 drivers to race. Leagues emerged where drivers would submit records of their single-player races and compare them with other drivers. This was also the first sim to introduce drafting or slipstreaming, and that was huge for 1992, and it progressed the sim racing genre further into reality. Many would consider this game the start of competitive sim racing. The first variant of Papyrus' NASCAR racing series was launched in 1994. It pushed the PCs of the time to the limit. Suddenly, the default resolution of 320 by 200 seemed a poor option, and this was the race sim of choice for anyone with a capable PC, particularly in North America. It was the first sim where cars no longer looked like boxes. It keyed in on sophisticated physics modelling. NASCAR racing sold over 1 million units. Moreover, the first real online racing started with NASCAR, using dial-in servers, and it was not uncommon to see early sim racers have $300 or $1,500 phone bills. Online racing had seen its first true realisation, and to many this was the dawn of real sim racing. In 1997, Gran Turismo was released for the PlayStation. It was considered the most realistic racing simulation for consoles at the time, featuring a wealth of meticulous tuning options and an open-ended career mode where players had to undertake driving tests and earn their way into races. It introduced the racing simulation genre to home consoles, becoming the basis for all modern racing sims on video game consoles. I would take a solid bet that this was the first ever racing game for many of you. Racing wheel peripherals were just becoming popular around the time, and it made sim racing accessible for many that couldn't afford a beefy computer. With almost 11 million copies sold, this was the most successful racing sim ever, although most users were playing on a gamepad. Another milestone in sim racing came in 1998 with the release of Grand Prix Legends, which was based on the '67 F1 season. It was hailed as outstanding in all areas, especially in its physics and sound design. For many players, their first experience of sim racing was through GPL. The release of a groundbreaking third-party add-on for GPL, Virtual Races Online, allowed players to join online in races together, thus birthing proper leagues. Since Grand Prix Legends, its publisher ImageSpace Incorporated has produced its own sims such as Sports Car GT in 1999 and the officially licensed F1 series starting in 2000, all published by EA. Unlike Papyrus, the physics are easily modified and many communities have been founded on the sole purpose of improving and updating their engines. One such community, Simbin, have created their own company and have since released several games themselves, including the free-to-play Race Room Racing experience, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with today. So that brings us up to the noughties and the tens. I'm sure many of you are familiar with what happens in the next 2 decades, but I'm briefly going to skim over everything. In 2003, a 3-man team began development on a racing simulator known as Live for Speed. The main focus was to provide a racing experience for the online multiplayer market. Live for Speed was entirely distributed via the internet and can still be downloaded to this day for free, but to unlock all the content you'll need to pay a fee. In 2004, rally fans received the first true rally simulator with Richard Burns Rally. To this day, it's still recognised by the community as the best rally sim available. Much like many sims from this era, RBR is highly modifiable and has many third-party mods that introduce VR and multiplayer. In 2008, co-founder of Papyrus, the creators of the Indy 500 game I mentioned earlier, released a new subscription-based model game called iRacing. Although it may be expensive to run an entire season on this sim, most of its users would consider it a price worth paying. All races and practice sessions are hosted on their servers, and they provide drivers with ranking, safety systems and hourly races, and racing dominates the market in providing a competitive experience. In 2012, ISI launched the open beta for rFactor 2. It went out of beta in 2013 mostly unfinished and was met with backlash from players. In 2016 however, Studio 397 took over development, with the aim to revamp and revive the title, making huge efforts to bring the series back to its prime with extensive customization and detailed physics. In 2014, Kunos released Assetto Corsa on early access. A sim built on experience gained from Netcar Pro, but with an entirely new engine. This new engine was designed to provide extensive and detailed tools for modding, allowing players to create highly detailed content with minimal effort. Now, 7 years later, AC is arguably the most popular sim on the market, and the modding scene is still going strong. Personally, this is my favourite sim out of any I've mentioned today. In 2016, Brazil's Razer Studios released Automobilista, a racing simulator featuring, among others, Formula racing trucks, rallycross and some lesser known Brazilian racing classes. In 2017, Project Cars 2 was launched by Slightly Mad Studios. It was a successor to Project Cars and used some suggestions from the community to help improve upon the previous version, introducing features such as rallycross, improved graphics, physics and more. In 2019, Kunos released Assetto Corsa Competizione, the spiritual successor to the wildly successful Assetto Corsa. The game aims to provide an accurate simulation of the GT3 and GT4 racing series. It's officially licensed and uses the Unreal Engine 4 for vastly improved graphics. In 2020, Razer released their second simulator, Automobilista 2. It had a slow early access launch, but it's improving month by month. I recommend you check it out if you haven't already. So that brings us to 2020. Hopefully in the next few years we'll see SimRacer take further leaps into realism. And if you're still watching, thank you. Please consider hitting those like and subscribe buttons if you enjoyed the video and want to see more. Oh, and by the way, thanks for 100 subs, it means a lot. Cheers.